The sea looked harmless on the map, just a pale blue pane labeled Bismar Sea, a corridor between Rabaul and the north coast of New Guinea. On paper, it was merely distance and bearings. Simpson Harbor to Lae, 8 transports, 8 destroyers, a screen of Zero and Oscar fighters overhead, and 6,900 men of the Imperial Japanese Army 51st Division packed into holds that smelled of rope, oil, and damp canvas. In reality, it was an ambush box already drawn and baited, a kill zone charted not by chance but by mathematics, mechanics, and intelligence. The decision to send that convoy was born in Tokyo in late December 1942, when staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters looked across a war map bleeding red pins. The New Guinea campaign had become a slow hemorrhage. The garrisons at Lae and Salamaua needed men, guns, radio batteries, and morphine. The order went out to the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, reinforce Lae at once. The plan looked orthodox. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura would take a mixed escort of destroyers, including Shirayuki, Asagumo, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and others, and shepherd a line of transports, Teo Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, and their sisters, down the slot. The convoy would hug weather and darkness, pass north of New Britain, then curl south and sprint the last miles. War games told an unromantic truth. Expect heavy losses and accept them. But Tokyo deemed the risk tolerable. If Lae was reinforced, the land battle might shift. If not, New Guinea could unravel. What the planners could not see from those polished tables was the other map, one spread across desks in Melbourne, Frumel, station hypo liaisons, and code rooms in Washington, D.C. There, teams of underslept linguists and mathematicians kneaded JN-25 fragments into legible orders. Dates, routes, tonnage, call signs. Each decoded sliver slid into a mosaic. By late February, Allied codebreakers had built a surprisingly clear itinerary. Departure from Simpson Harbor, a schedule that counted on cloud ceilings, the approximate makeup of the escort. The convoy would not sneak through a blind sea, it would enter a theater already lit. Across the Owen Stanley Range at 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George C. Kenney studied that mosaic like a gunsmith, admiring a new action. For months, he'd pushed a heresy. If heavy bombers could not reliably hit maneuvering ships from altitude, then bring the fight down to wave top and cheat physics with technique. His crews, Americans and Australians, had drilled on a skill dredged from fishing piers and childhood, skip bombing, throwing a bomb low and fast so it skips across the water like a stone, strikes a hull at the waterline, and detonates inside steel. To turn theory into slaughter, he greenlit a brutal modification binge. B-25. Mitchells lost their glazed noses and grew metal snouts bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. 8 forward firing in some cases, with cheek packs and waist guns bolted on by men who measured improvements in rivets and exit wounds. A-20 Havocs got the same thug's grin. RAF bowfighters, already famous for their snarling speed and 420mm cannon, would scissor in at mast height, hosing decks and gun crews so the bombers could run in unblinded. It was combined arms without ships, Allied air power forged into a surface strike doctrine. Training films couldn't teach the violence that doctrine required, so crews learned in cane fields and over reefs. Navigators practiced wave-top runs that made altimeters irrelevant. Pilots drilled on speed gates, 240 knots, 260, 280, fast enough to make flak brackets late and gunners flinch. Gunners learned to rake from bow to stern, never stopping long enough to duel a single mount. Bombardiers became timing artists. They dropped at distances that felt suicidal until the splash bang proved the math. The New Guinea weather, that mercurial ally, was charted like a teacher's mood. Storm lines, morning haze, the slant where mountain winds pour into sea lanes. Every scrap of trend pointed to one ultimate exam: meet a convoy in open water and erase it. The convoy sailed at dusk on February 28, 1943. From the breakwater of Rabaul, civilians watched black silhouettes move like a procession of intent. In the holds, men of the 51st Division shared cigarettes and letters. Pressed against sacks of rice and crate-stamped ammunition, they were veterans of China and Guadalcanal offshoots, told that Lae would be their proving ground. The destroyermen on Shirayuki rigged extra-ready ammo lockers. Signalmen practiced torch code. Officers went over their anti-air doctrine again and again. Altitude plots, crossing patterns, the classic ladder of ack that looks good on chalkboards. If the enemy attacked from high altitude, the plan was neat: disrupt formation, jink, reform under fighter umbrella. It was the if nobody wanted to say aloud, if they come at mast height, if they rake us flat, that had no tidy arrows. March 1st dawned with a rendezvous of propellers. The convoy rounded the north coast of New Britain just as an American B-24 Liberator droned into view. The reconnaissance bird played its part, high, aloof, wide wings flashing sunlight, but its presence was a telegram. We see you. Kimura's bridge understood the message and tightened the formation, bringing destroyers in closer to swat at angles the fighters couldn't cover. The air guard overhead, Zeros and Nakajimas, tightened their racetrack patterns. The sea itself looked honest, dimples of white where breeze scratched the surface. The wash, where each destroyer's wake shouldered aside the transport's plodding roll. You could almost imagine slipping past unmolested. Nothing about this was going to be unmolested. Back at Port Moresby, grease pencils traced vectors on ops boards. Controllers fed headings to B-17 flying fortresses idling at dispersal, to Beaufighters warmed on steel Marsden matting, to the new strafer B-25s whose noses looked like gun store windows. The plan was orchestral. B-17s would set the sky on fire at high altitude, pulling defensive eyes up and splitting Japanese fighter cover. As the convoy's deck guns threw black puffs at invisible specks, the mast height killers would rip the scene flat, Beaufighters first to shred gun crews, then B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs charging in pairs down the lanes the Aussies cut. It wasn't just about bombs, it was about smothering the convoy's ability to think. Before ordnance, there was paperwork and ritual. Crews skimmed mission folders fat with ultra-derived timings. Briefing officers underlined lay as the destination and called out ship silhouettes by name and tonnage. The chalkboard listed Kyokusei Maru and Teo Maru at over 5,000 tons apiece, fat targets whose death would ripple into everything ashore. Gunners counted belts and swapped barrels, some taped coins to their lucky spots under seats. One crew chief drew a neat white line on the floor of a Mitchell. Don't step past here when we're running in. A sergeant folded a picture of his wife into his flight log as if the weight of the paper might hold the nose down. Just after midday, the first rehearsal went live. The B-17s appeared at spindrift altitudes and began their walks. Bomb bays yawned, sticks fell, ships weaved. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships is a lottery, but sometimes the numbers smile. A transport took a hit and bloomed orange, drums of aviation fuel roaring into a torch that stained the sea. Another ship hobbled, a destroyer threw foam to turn toward survivors, and the convoy's formation logic began to loosen. The Japanese fighter escort did their work, passes through the bomber boxes, the flash of tracers and contrails, but every second those Zeros fought at 15,000 feet was a second not spent nosing at a horizon full of low-approach vectors. All afternoon, 5th Air Force watched the rhythm like a boxer feeling out a taller opponent. Weather held, an overcast ceiling that threatened to close, and then, as if by design, fractured into broad, silver windows. Reconnaissance plots came in at intervals, convoy speed, position relative to Finisterre range, the telltale scatter that says a formation is bleeding cohesion. Dusk wrote long copper lines across the water. Kimura pushed his escorts hard, knowing that a night run could hide him from one kind of enemy and deliver him to another, PT boats and their teeth. But the math of distance remained remorseless. The convoy would still be within reach after dawn. The Americans labeled the next morning D-Day for the Bismar Sea. Meanwhile, morale swung on both sides like a boom in variable wind. In the holds, men of the 51st Division, infantry, signals, machine gun companies traded rumors. The B-17 strike, though distant, had been visible from the transport rails. Everyone understood that an enemy who could find you today would find you again tomorrow. Yet, soldiers are experts at making normal out of anything. They tightened bootlaces, penned lines to wives, polished bayonets by habit, told each other that Lay's airfields and fortifications would soak up any future losses. On the destroyers, officers adjusted AA fire plans, crossers and clippers, barrage gates, how to keep Beaufighters from raking a bridge twice. Someone always drew the lines, someone always assumed lines would hold. Across the range, crews tried to sleep amid that peculiar pre-engagement hum. Hand pumps chuffing fuel, a distant generator hacking, mess kits clanking. Kenny walked the dispersal and said little. The doctrine he'd shepherded, skip bombing and low-level strafing, had already paid out in smaller engagements. Tomorrow would be the large-type headline, the test that either confirms a revolution or sends it back to the lab. In the briefing room, a final chalk scrawl listed roles. Number 30 Squadron RAF on deck suppression, 3rd Bomb Group and 90th Squadron B-25s as the hammer, B-17s again as the sky magnet, A-20s to tidy up stragglers, P-38 Lightnings to slash at any fighters that dove low to defend. If air power could behave like a fleet, this was the battle plan of a fleet commander. In Rabaul's Simpson Harbor that same night, the rear echelon heard nothing but their own nervousness. Intelligence officers parsed their own reports and, as always, found confidence in the lines they liked best. Weather tomorrow looked marginal. Good. Allied airfields were far. Good. Fighter cover would be abundant. Good. Yet every comforting sentence had a shadow clause. If the Americans attack as they did today but heavier, if they come lower, if they can keep their schedule despite clouds, if their pilots are as aggressive as rumor says. War's a ledger of ifs balanced against facts. The facts were that the convoy had been seen, hit, and marked. The ifs were whether it could survive another day of that attention. Dawn of March 2nd broke neither friendly nor hostile, just gray, the kind of light that keeps secrets. The convoy advanced, corrected, and advanced again. In the cockpits on the other side of the sea, crews sealed canopies and found their talismans. One B-25 pilot ran a gloved thumb along the bead sight atop his guns, the old-school iron still perched there like a dare. A Beaufighter navigator tucked a photo of his father, Gallipoli veteran, into a map pocket as if to smuggle him along for one more go. A B-17 bombardier, calm in the ritual of settings, verified fusing twice and then did it again. On an A-20, a crew chief rapped the cowling twice, hard, like knocking on a door only the plane could answer. By mid-morning, weather clarified into opportunity. The convoy had covered nearly 2/3 of the distance to lay, too far to run home, too close to safe harbor to relax. Allied reconnaissance sketched a position update that felt like a green light. The strike packages rolled. From altitude, the B-17s arrived first, their timing crisp, their purpose more distraction than destruction now. Flak rose in layered bouquets, black where heavy guns punched, brownish-gray where lighter calibers coughed. The spectacle did what it was meant to do, drag Japanese fighters and lookouts into the sky's theater. Then the horizon changed shape. To Kimura's lookouts, it seemed at first like heat mirage, a line of glints at the world's edge. Another tick of the second hand, and the glints lengthened into angry scratches. Beaufighters and B-25s riding ground effect, low enough that their prop wash carved white fingerprints on the sea. Bridge crews shouted bearings, signal flags jumped, helmsmen hauled wheels. Men at the transport rails, already jittery, stared as the first Beaufighters came on, noses flicking brief tongue flames as 20mm and .303 streams reached across the last 100 yards. Deck guns that had been scanning the sky tried to depress. Too late. The mast height doctrine the Allies had honed for months was now a living, screaming thing. The opening minutes were not the massacre, yet they were the unseating. Fire control crews died mid-gesture, canvas-ready ammo covers leapt into flame, bridge windows spider-webbed. The defenders replied, some with deadly effect, but they were answering a test whose correct response was not in their manual. Every instinct the convoy had was vertical. The attack required them to think flat. Through the gaps the Australians cut, the B-25 strafers surged, 850s fused into a single blunt instrument. Each pair ran a bow-on profile, chewing through forecastles, then walking tracers into gun tubs and bridge wings. The bombers were not bombing yet. They were silencing. Up in the B-17s, bombardiers tracked the chaos and called hits, but the real arithmetic was happening just above the water. A Mitchell leveled, throttles firewalled, the pilot reading the ship's relative motion like a quarterback reading a safety. At a pre-computed distance, close enough to feel spray, his bomb toggler punched release. A 500-pounder left the rack, skipped once, twice, then struck at the waterline and disappeared inside. Detonation turned steel into confetti and columns of brown-black smoke into punctuation. Another Mitchell did the same to the next ship in line. All those hours of dirt strip practice now paid out in seconds. Skip bombing wasn't a trick. It was an execution method. On Shirayuki's bridge, Rear Admiral Kimura clung to process. Signals to realign, orders to escorts to countercharge, calls to fighters to drop. Process is how professionals keep fear from driving. But processes live on time, and time, in those minutes, belonged to the men thundering down the lanes with guns already talking. The convoy's speed, its geometry, its hope of maintaining cohesion. Everything was being rewritten in 50-caliber lines and blast waves. By late morning, with the sky still combed by contrails and the surface scribbled by wakes and smoke, the stage was set for the 15 minutes that would decide more than a convoy. Allied air power, skip bombing doctrine, intelligence fusion, and the relentless practicality of men like Kenny had converged in one place. The Japanese had sailed believing the sea could still be theirs if they moved fast and fought hard. The Americans and Australians were about to prove that the sea now belonged to whoever owned the air above it. The clock ticked to 10:00 a.m., March 3, 1943. The next quarter hour would look like a physics demonstration conducted by wolves. Ships would break in half, a flagship would vanish in a single white-hot inhalation. Survivors would cover their faces in oil and prayer. And the men in the attacking cockpits, trained for this exact geometry, would keep doing their jobs until the geometry ended. The convoy's death began not with explosions but with shadows, dark stencils gliding across the pale water of the Bismar Sea. At 09:45 on March 2nd, the first wave of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from the United States Army Air Forces thundered in from the north, their silver bellies glinting. They were the sky magnets sent by George Kenny to draw the Japanese gaze upward. Their role was as much psychological as destructive. Break formation discipline, make officers shout conflicting orders and bait the fighter escort out of position. The Japanese formation reacted with textbook neatness. Zeros and Oscars clawed skyward in bright spirals, crossing into the bomber boxes with cannon fire. The convoy below began the prescribed evasive jinking, port, starboard, port, engines groaning as helmsmen threw bulk-laden transports through zigzag arcs meant for lighter ships. On paper, this was the correct response. In reality, it played directly into the trap. At 10:22, the lead B-17 Flying Fortress released its stick. 500-pounders cascaded like tumbling anvils. Most missed. Distance bombing against maneuvering targets is a lottery. But one bomb hit Kyokusei Maru, a 5,493-ton transport packed with men and drums of aviation fuel. The detonation tore her open like a paper lantern. Survivors later described the explosion as a white wall, a flash so bright it cast shadows on the clouds above. Burning fuel sheeted across the water. Nearby, the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze wheeled out of formation to pluck oil-soaked men from the flames. It was an act of humanity that would cost them minutes, and in this ambush, minutes were a currency more precious than ammunition. The rest of the B-17 swung wide, looping back for harassing passes. Their actual damage was secondary. They had succeeded at their main purpose, force the Japanese eyes upward, which meant when the true killers arrived, they came in unseen until they were too close to stop. At 10:00 on March 3rd, while the Japanese still watched the high-altitude contrails, the sea horizon split like a knife wound. From the west, at less than 200 feet, came the Australian No. 30 Squadron RAAF Bristol Bowfighters. 13 of them, their broad noses smoking with power, their 4 20mm cannon and 6 303s already spitting fire. They weren't bombing. They were erasing defenses. The Bowfighters' attack was surgical in its savagery. They came in pairs, each screaming just above the wave tops, raking bridge windows, gun tubs, and AA mounts with streams of tracer. Japanese gunners, trained to fire in layered vertical brackets, swung their barrels down far too late. Many died mid-gesture. On Teomaru, bridge crewmen were cut down before they could even shout bearings. Gun crews who survived the first pass dove for cover, abandoning their mounts to the firestorm. This was the doctrine George Kenney had envisioned. Deck suppression first, bombing second. The bowfighters sliced the convoy's defensive reflexes to ribbons. And right behind them, through the smoke, came the sledgehammers. The B-25 Mitchells of the 90th Squadron appeared at mast height, their gun nose profiles bristling with 8 forward-firing 50s each. They were low enough that their prop wash kicked rooster tails off the water. At their head flew Captain Ed Larner, often misremembered as Lana in post-war accounts, who had drilled his crews for months for this single moment. As the bowfighters pulled away, Larner lined up on Teo Maru. At 800 yards, his nose guns opened, a blinding wall of tracers that walked from the bow to the bridge, killing anyone who might still be aiming. At 300 yards, his bombardier toggled the release. 2 500-pounders left the racks, skipped twice like thrown stones, and smashed into Teo Maru at the waterline. The transport's hull burst like a splitting log, breaking in half in under 2 minutes. Other B-25s followed suit in staggered pairs, turning the convoy lanes into slaughter alleys. The technique worked with mechanical precision. Guns first to blind and deafen, bombs next to split the spine. One Mitchell drove a bomb straight into Oigawa Maru, which vanished in a rolling orange globe. Another gutted Taime Maru, oil fires sheeted across the surface, carried on the wake lines like black lace unraveling. In the heart of the formation, Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, still trying to salvage command. He had fought through years of convoy duty and knew the price of panic. He signaled his surviving escorts to counterattack, ordered the transports to scatter, but even as he gave those orders, his own ship became target. A B-25 pair bore down the Shirayuki's bow. Their combined nose guns pinned every visible gunner to the deck in a maelstrom of 50 caliber. At 250 yards, 2 bombs skipped, rose, and punched into Shirayuki's forward magazine. The blast ripped the destroyer into incandescent fragments. Witnesses on nearby decks said the sea briefly stood upright where the ship had been. Kimura and most of his bridge crew died instantly. The death of the flagship dissolved what remained of order. Signals stopped. Radio discipline shattered. Each Japanese captain now fought alone in a fog of burning oil. From first bowfighter cannon burst to Shirayuki's annihilation was barely 15 minutes. By 10:15 a.m., every transport had been hit, several already sinking, and 3 destroyers were crippled or gone. The sea was no longer blue. It was striped black by oil slicks, red by blood, and white by the hiss of fire hoses and steam. The surviving escorts, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikanami, began frantic rescue runs, hauling hundreds of men from burning wakes even as they dodged bombs. Their decks became charnel houses, oil-soaked soldiers coughing seawater, medics sliding on fuel film, stretchers stacked near still-warm shell casings. But the attackers were not done. Wave after wave of A-20 Havocs, B-25s, and P-38 Lightnings kept rolling in, hammering anything still afloat. The attacks were now disjointed and savage, like wolves tearing pieces from a dying bull. By noon, the convoy had ceased to exist as a formation. It was just wreckage fields drifting toward Leh, broken keels, splintered masts, scattered corpses, and clinging men. The environment itself joined the killing. Bunker oil coated the surface, trapping heat and choking swimmers. Wounded men clung to planks that reeked of gasoline. Even small sparks from strafing guns ignited slicks in rolling patches. Japanese soldiers who had never learned to swim clawed at floating bodies to stay above the film, and all the while, overhead, Allied aircraft circled, radios calm, fuel gauges still ample. One American pilot later called it like shooting into an ant farm from above. The precision shocked even them. The months of skip-bombing drills and mast-height gunnery had produced a weapon system more efficient than anyone had dared predict. The Battle of the Bismar Sea was no longer a battle. It was a demonstration of annihilation as a method. By the time the last Allied attackers peeled away that afternoon, the Bismarck Sea was a floating graveyard. The Japanese survivors, thousands of them, would drift for hours in oil and shock, unaware that their ordeal was not even halfway over. What awaited them next would break the last boundary between warfare and slaughter. By early afternoon on March 3, 1943, the Battle of the Bismar Sea should have been over. The convoy had been obliterated, all 7 remaining transports destroyed or sinking, 3 destroyers lost, and over 3,000 men thrown into the water. The few surviving escorts, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikanami, were crammed with scorched, half-drowned survivors and running low on ammunition. Thick bunker oil slicked the surface for miles, turning the sea black and flammable. Smoke coiled up like funeral banners. And still, the killing was not finished. What followed would burn itself into memory not as battle, but as slaughter. The scene was apocalyptic. The surface of the Bismar Sea had become a soup of oil, gasoline, wreckage, and human bodies. Thousands of Japanese soldiers from the Imperial Japanese Army 51st Division clung to splintered planks, overturned lifeboats, and floating corpses. Most had never been taught to swim. Wounded men bled freely into the water, drawing sharks that sliced through the slicks in sudden thrashing bursts. The survivors had watched their ships torn apart in minutes. Now they bobbed amid burning debris, gasping in the stench of fuel oil, charred flesh, and cordite, staring skyward at the distant glimmer of circling aircraft. Many thought the attackers had gone. That assumption would soon prove fatal. At 1400 hours, the drone returned. B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and Australian Bristol Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron RAIF, now flying not as bombers, but as executioners. At first, the Japanese survivors waved, mistaking them for reconnaissance planes photographing the wreckage. Then the aircraft dropped to wave height, and 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon opened fire. The sea erupted in white geysers as bullets ripped through rafts. Lifeboats and human bodies sending arcs of blood across the oil film. Panic shattered any attempt at order. Soldiers tried to dive under, but the thick oil clung to them, slowed them, marked them. Some burned as bullets ignited the fuel around them. Others were cut in half trying to swim for drifting wreckage. It was not combat. It was systematic denial. George Kenney's orders were explicit. No Japanese soldier is to reach New Guinea alive. To the Americans and Australians, this was a tactical imperative. If even a fraction of these men swam or drifted ashore, they would reinforce Lae and prolong the New Guinea campaign. To the Japanese, still steeped in Bushido code, it was incomprehensible. Bushido taught that once a warrior was defeated, he should be treated with dignity. What they experienced instead was aerial hunting. As dusk bled across the sea, the Allied aircraft departed, leaving survivors trembling among the wreckage. The silence that followed was worse. The surface flickered with small fires. The horizon glowed faint orange from sinking oil drums. Beneath the silence lurked new killers. Sharks arrived at sunset. Drawn by blood and vibration, they began attacking isolated groups. Sudden eruptions of foam, a scream, and then nothing. Men kicked and clung tighter to rafts slick with fuel. Some went mad from thirst, trying to drink seawater that only deepened their delirium. Others whispered prayers into the oil as if it could carry words to shore. Then, around 2300 hours, new engines approached, PT boats from the United States Navy under Barry Atkins. 10 boats prowled the blackness, their bow wakes glowing faint blue with phosphorescence. They used searchlights to sweep for survivors, then raked them with machine guns. PT-43 and PT-150 found the shattered hulk of Oigawa Maru still afloat and torpedoed it, sending more men screaming into the sea. Other PTs simply followed trails of voices in the darkness. Searchlight, burst, silence, move on. Survivors later described this night as worse than the airstrikes. At least bombs came quickly. This was slow hunting. They could hear the boats approaching long before the shots came, each pass like a verdict whispered across the water. Men who had survived flames, strafing, and sharks now drowned under the weight of their comrades as panic drove them to climb atop each other to escape the killing arcs. The remaining Japanese destroyers tried to resist this nightmare. Asagumo, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Shikanami zigzagged through firelit debris, hauling aboard as many men as they could before dawn. Their decks became slick charnel houses. The smell of fuel oil, vomit, and cauterized flesh made even veteran sailors retch. But they could not save them all. Hundreds still floated in the slick, too weak to climb the nets or fight for space on the destroyer's heaving decks. Many begged to be shot rather than left behind. Officers ignored them, ordered engines to full, and retreated before Allied bombers returned with the sunrise. By dawn, they had carried roughly 2,700 survivors back toward Rabaul, but more than 3,000 still floated. At first light on March 4th, the attackers returned not to fight a convoy but to exterminate survivors. B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, Bristol Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightnings swept back over the 40-mile debris field. They attacked any visible movement, lifeboats, rafts, even swimmers clinging to planks. One prime target was the crippled destroyer Asashio, which had lingered to rescue men from the wreck of Arashio. At 009:10 hours, a B-17 Flying Fortress dropped a 500-pound bomb directly into her deck, detonating near her magazines. Asashio sank in minutes, dragging hundreds of rescued men down with her. The attackers called this phase mopping up. Pilots had seen comrades murdered by Japanese fighters while parachuting in earlier battles, including the Double Trouble B-17 crew, who were machine-gunned as they floated down in parachutes. That memory fueled their fury. Radio logs recorded General George Kenney's standing order: "Leave no survivors who can reach shore." It was the logic of annihilation. The dead could not reinforce Leh, could not shoot back, could not drag the campaign out for another bloody year. As the airstrikes rolled on, nature continued its quiet harvest. Shark attacks multiplied as blood spread and the churning of propellers stirred deep predators closer. Patrols in the aftermath reported fins cutting through the oil sheens and sudden vortices of thrashing limbs and crimson froth. Japanese soldiers tried to form human rings to defend themselves, but as exhaustion set in, the rings broke apart. Witnesses later described hearing screams followed by gurgling silence, then only the slap of waves. Even Allied pilots were shaken by what they saw below. Men clinging to corpses, others slashing at sharks with bayonets lashed to planks, then vanishing in boils of red. In the following nights, 2 Japanese submarines, I-17 and I-26, crept through the debris field dodging Allied patrols. They managed to rescue 170 survivors on March 6th and another 54 on March 8th, dropping them ashore at Leh. Their crews described haunting scenes, oil-blackened men sobbing, too weak to climb the nets, forced to be dragged aboard by their hair. Cries in the dark as the sub slipped past hundreds they could not take. They had to choose who would live, knowing those left behind would die before sunrise. By the evening of March 4th, the sea was mostly silent. The fires burned down to slick rainbows. Sharks drifted fat and slow in the fading light. Allied patrols circled high, marking any last clusters of survivors for the final mopping runs. The Bismar Sea, which had been a highway for Japan's hopes, had become a floating graveyard. Of the 6,900 men sent from Rabaul, barely 1,200 made it to Leh. And for the men who survived, this was no mere defeat. It was a revelation that their enemy would hunt them even as they drowned, that the war they thought they understood had changed into something merciless. By the time the last echoes of gunfire faded from the Bismar Sea, the numbers told an almost unbelievable story. Of the 6,900 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army 51st Division who had embarked from Rabaul on February 28th, barely 1,200 reached Leh alive. Another 2,700 were dragged back to Rabaul by the few surviving destroyers or plucked from the wreckage days later by submarines. More than 3,000 men were dead, killed by bombs, machine gun fire, burning oil, drowning, or torn apart by sharks. The Battle of the Bismar Sea had lasted 3 days. Its casualty ratio, over 230 Japanese lost for every 1 Allied airman killed, was unprecedented in naval warfare. The United States Army Air Forces and Royal Australian Air Force lost only 13 airmen and 4 aircraft. In exchange, they had annihilated all 8 transports and 4 destroyers and shattered Japan's last major attempt to reinforce New Guinea by surface convoy. It was not just a victory, it was a transformation, and it sent shockwaves through the Pacific. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the disaster detonated like a bomb of its own. The staff officers who had once traced the convoy's route on polished maps now stared at casualty reports in stunned silence. Admiral Minichi Koga, who had just succeeded Isoroku Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, issued a grim assessment. Surface vessels cannot survive under enemy-controlled skies. In blunt terms, New Guinea was now considered indefensible. The Japanese Navy would never again risk large convoys into waters dominated by Allied forces' air power. Reinforcement of forward garrisons would now depend on submarines and small, fast barges that could slip through the night, but never in decisive strength again. For the United States Army Air Forces and Royal Australian Air Force, the lesson was the opposite. Air power alone could annihilate naval forces, even without carrier groups. This became a cornerstone of Douglas MacArthur's Pacific strategy, isolating Japanese strongholds by cutting their supply lines with land-based bombers. The New Guinea campaign would now shift irreversibly in the Allies' favor. Lae, Salamaua, and the whole northern coast would wither on the vine. For the Japanese survivors who crawled ashore or returned to Rabaul, the trauma went far beyond defeat. They had witnessed what seemed to them an abandonment of the Bushido Code. Bushido taught that a warrior who was defeated or shipwrecked should be shown dignity, and that honorable combat ended when a man could no longer resist. The men of the 51st Division had expected to die in battle, swords in hand. Instead, they saw American and Australian aircraft machine-gunning helpless men in the water, strafing lifeboats, and even torching oil-slicked survivors who had dropped their weapons. For them, this was not war, it was extermination. The psychological shock was profound. Many survivors described losing all faith in ultimate victory. They began to believe that if captured, they would certainly be executed and thus resolved to fight to the death rather than surrender. This mindset would echo through the rest of the Pacific War at Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, where Japanese units fought to annihilation rather than yield. The strafing of survivors remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Under international humanitarian law, shipwrecked enemy personnel who are no longer resisting are supposed to be protected. But the law was vague about combatants who had not formally surrendered. American commanders argued that these men were not prisoners but active enemy soldiers still within swimming distance, only 10-15 miles from Lae, and would rejoin the fight if they survived. Many Allied airmen were also enraged by previous Japanese atrocities such as the Bataan Death March, the rape of Nanking, and incidents where Japanese pilots machine-gunned parachuting B-17 Flying Fortress crews. General George Kenney called the post-battle strafing mopping up operations. Internally, a secret report dated March 20, 1943 recorded, "The slaughter continued till nightfall. If any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a minimum of 30 miles from land and water thickly infested by man-eating sharks." No Allied personnel were ever prosecuted. The official U.S. Shores position held that it was military necessity, not a war crime. Historians still debate this. Many note the double standard, as several Japanese officers were later executed for similar acts. But in 1943, as one analyst put it, victor's justice was the only justice available. Beyond tactics, the battle delivered a psychological weapon. The image of Allied aircraft methodically hunting survivors spread like a contagion through the Japanese ranks. Soldiers whispered that the sea itself kills you if you face the Americans. Desertion rates rose in units scheduled for sea transport. Some soldiers slashed their own palms before boarding, as if tasting blood early could protect them from drowning in it later. The idea that defeat meant not surrender but extermination became lodged deep in the imperial military psyche. This fear shaped countless later battles, convincing Japanese defenders to fight on hopelessly because capture seemed equivalent to death. The ruthlessness of the Bismarck Sea became an invisible weapon, killing Japanese morale even before bullets flew. For the Allies, the battle became proof that technology and doctrine had remade war itself. The combination of code-breaking intelligence from Frumell and station hypo-skip bombing from B-25, Mitchell's massed height strafing by Bristol Beaufighters, air-sea coordination without carriers, had produced a victory once thought impossible without battleships. General Douglas MacArthur hailed it as the decisive aerial engagement of the Southwest Pacific. Historians agree. After the Battle of the Bismar Sea, Japan never again held the strategic initiative in New Guinea. Modern analysts often cite the battle as the birth of true joint air-sea interdiction warfare, a template for how air power can strangle maritime logistics. What began as an experiment in skip bombing had ended as a blueprint for annihilation. For the Japanese who survived, there was no blueprint, only trauma. Many never spoke of it. Others, interviewed decades later, said the strongest memory was not the explosions, but the eyes. Hundreds of faces staring from the water, watching the aircraft turn back toward them. They had set out to fight the Americans. Instead, they had been hunted. The battle's legacy was more than strategic, it was existential. It proved that war had changed from contests of courage to contests of industrial efficiency, where technology could erase men faster than honor could save them. In 3 days in March 1943, the Allies showed they had become something new, no longer the stunned victims of Pearl Harbor, but cold practitioners of mechanized annihilation. The soldiers who carried that lesson home would shape the rest of the war and the world that came after.